Also, at this time, there's a close relationship between the civil power and the religious power. The king was king by the grace of God. He was anointed by his bishop. The emperor was anointed by the pope. There was a the kings, the civil power, relied on the religious power for its authority, in other words. Right? So the king was king by the grace of God. And so there was a very close link between the church and between the king or the emperor. So heretics from this moment on are no longer seen as erring souls, mistaken souls in a world filled with temptation. They begin to be seen as subverters of the right order of things. This is a change of mentality. If your world, if your society is going to be Christian, then anyone who is undermining the Christian faith is also undermining public order. At that time, then, we can say that in Christian society, the Catholic faith was the bond of unity, and the basis for all social, political, and legal structures. And canon law was being enforced church law was being enforced by the state. It was like the cement holding the society together. And so public order, the order of faith, they really coincided to a large degree at that time. So to break the order of faith was to subvert the proper ordering of society in the minds of almost everyone at that time. So the church and the state, they began to cooperate in order to suppress treason, in order to suppress heresy, which was seen as treason. In other words, if you believe that the society should be Christian, it should be Orthodox, and someone begins to preach another doctrine and brings people away from the faith, then not only was the church upset by this because it was heresy, but the emperor and the king and then the count and the duke, they were also upset because it also undermined their position. And I know it's hard for us to understand this, but in the Middle Ages, heresy was always linked to subversion. That by bringing people away from the Catholic faith, they were also bringing people away from the obedience to the authority of the civil power. And this is uniform. And there was no private heresy where people said, this is my conscience, I want to follow this. It was always had the effect of undermining the authority of the civil power. And that is why the civil power became involved in such a ferocious way during this time, because it was protecting its own rights. So it was always seditious. It always sought to undermine the prevailing authority, and faith and salvation were the overriding values. At this time, there is no notion of individual human rights. The ideas of human dignity, religious freedom that we have, this has been developed over many centuries. There was nothing of this. One was born in the church or was born under the law. There was no social mobility, as we were saying. If your parents were a serf, you were a serf, and that's all there was to it. There were no political rights, and there were no freedom of expression, freedom of association, right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of those ideas come about in the 18th century, or they're not ideas that were even dreamt of in the early Middle Ages. One was considered as receiving privileges when one was baptized. When one became a citizen of Christendom at baptism, one received privileges, and by subverting the faith, one lost those privileges. One forfeited those privileges in the minds of people. What was heresy? We talked about that yesterday. A heresy was an opinion freely chosen, contrary to sacred scripture and the teaching of the church, but which pretended to be Christian. And it was something that was taught and defended. It was externalized. The church never bothered about what people thought. If you wanted to think something and you didn't externalize it, nobody really cared. It was when you started to express ideas contrary to the faith, and you began to try to convince other people to do this. If you want to imagine the idea there, you can think about what happens in some Muslim countries these days. If a Catholic goes to a Muslim country and he tries to convert a Muslim, he will, in the more radical regimes, he will be killed. It's a capital crime to try to convert a Muslim. And if you do convert him, he'll be killed as well. So the Middle Ages was not that ferocious, but the same mentality was there. The Muslims think that their law, is the basis of their society, and so anyone who is coming in to do something to subvert that is an enemy, and he is to be dealt with. The Inquisition is going to begin in southern France in the 13th century. That's when a group called the Cathars, or the Albigensians, they have two different names, they settled there in the 12th century. There's a heresy that came from the east. It was what we call a dualist heresy. So they believed that matter was evil. There were two gods, a good god and an evil god. The evil god had created matter, the good god had created spirit. And because of this, all matter was bad, marriage was bad, procreation was bad. They felt that they were above any law, so no oath would bind them. And as you can see, the oath was the basis of all feudal society. You took an oath of loyalty to your feudal lord. So by denying the value of oaths, they were in fact undermining the society. The thing is that with the Cathars, they managed to win over a number of lords, a number of nobility in southern France. The power of the King of France was very weak in southern France. It was no more around Paris. And these local lords, they wanted more autonomy from the King of Paris. And so they went over to this heresy, and precisely in order to be able to be more autonomous and more independent from the king in France, king in Paris. Now, the Albigensians were never a monolithic movement. There were differences among them, there were different groups, and they didn't agree with each other, as always is the case. And what the church did when it realized what was happening was to send in preachers, and the most famous of which was St. Bernard of Clairvaux. In the 12th century, he went there and began preaching and began to win back some people to the Catholic faith. But by the time the church started doing this, it was a little late. They had probably installed themselves sometime in the 10th century, and so it took, by the time that the preachers went in, it was already been established for 50 to 75 years. It had been growing in that area, and so the preaching, although it was effective up to a point, it was not effective enough. Two other forces that were at work here. One is that the civil legislation against heretics was very harsh. If somebody was found guilty of heresy, all his goods were confiscated and he was either exiled or executed, usually executed. Now, the second point, though, is that people didn't like heresy. They really saw heresy as a danger, or a subversive. There are cases where a preacher would go into a town and begin preaching against the Catholic faith, and then there would be a lynch mob. There's one case which is described in one of the documents where the person, he put a fire, he was throwing the Bibles onto the fire, and finally he threw a crucifix onto the fire, at which point the crowd picked him up and threw him on the fire, because they weren't very happy with that. So there were lynch mobs. So the Inquisition is going to be an effort by the church to make sure, because of course you have this mob violence sometimes, to try to do this in an orderly way according to law. So what the church did, it also ordered episcopal visits. So the bishops were supposed to go and to root out this heresy, but again, it wasn't effective. Often because the bishop himself was a local bishop, and if he wasn't won over himself, and he was probably friends of these nobility, and the relationship between the bishop and the nobility in a place was very strong, and so he was ineffective in trying to stamp this out. So at one point, well, first of all, what Innocent III does is to call the Albigensian Crusade. And so in the year 1208, before that, or a little before that, in the year 1208, he sends a legate. He sends a deputy there to investigate, and the Albigensians, they assassinate the papal legate in 1208. That was not a thing to do. The Pope Innocent III was the most powerful Pope in history. That's in the history of the Middle Ages. You didn't assassinate his deputy. So having done that, he realized the situation had gotten out of control, and he asked the nobles, the king of France and his nobles, to organize a crusade against these people, which they happily did, because it would be a way of reasserting their authority in southern France. So they went in there, and they defeated the Cathar armies militarily, but very easily, and then they confiscated some of their land, and then the Cathars at this point go underground. So they no longer meet in official places, but they go underground and they continue their preaching, and they continue to spread their ideas throughout southern France.